Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Curtis Lehman, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Psychology. And I am excited to talk with you about depression and movement. I'm actually a clinical psychologist, and that's my background. And when I'm teaching about depression, typically I'm teaching to an audience of undergraduate students. That's a primary audience that I teach abnormal psychology to. And so I'm actually really excited to talk with you as doctorate of physical therapy students. And I believe maybe a few of you might be PhD in the rehab program. And I'm excited to talk with you about this relationship because I know that your interest may be more predominantly in the physical aspects of human existence. But I am excited because I get to talk to you about the mental aspects of human existence, but actually talk about it and say, well, those two aren't as distinct as one might think. And that's the whole point of this. So let me give you a little bit of an outline for what I hope to do in this hour. I want to talk about depression and movement and really emphasize that the movement or psychomotor activity is really an underappreciated aspect of depression. Here you can kind of see a little bit of an outline for what I'm hoping to talk with you about. So first off, I really want to, in this hour, I want to challenge you to reconceptualize your view on depression. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Then I want to review or introduce you to the how we diagnose people with depression, in particular major depression. I want to talk a little bit about biological findings related to depression, and in particular, I want to point out that some of the biological findings on depression intersect with what we already know about the biology of movement, and then I'll talk you through a couple of the articles that I have as readings for this talk, and finally I'll briefly mention what are the implications for treatment. Okay, so to start off, I really want to tackle some preconceptions because oftentimes people come to, well, we go about our lives and we receive messages about depression. Depression's certainly it's out there in our culture. Where we talk about depression, we see commercials about it, we see it in movies, and there's a cultural context that is portrayed, that portrays a certain representation of what depression is. And of course, each of our cultural contexts are a little bit different. Um, uh, sometimes it's shaped by our religious backgrounds. Sometimes it's shaped by our ethnic and family backgrounds. Well, not sometimes, it's always shaped by those factors. And so we hear these depictions of depression and we see them on movies and TV. And what happens is we individually come up with a sort of a prototypical understanding of what depression entails. So we developed this even before we started college, let alone graduate school. And so part of the process of understanding depression is being able to disassemble some of our views of depression that might not actually be entirely accurate, but also reassemble it with a complete picture. So I imagine that many of you, when you think about depression, there might be just sort of a parallel view, like, okay, depression is sadness. I think this is kind of where I came from personally when I thought about depression. It's just feelings of, not just, but there's feelings of sadness. Other people, when they think about depression, in fact, I also kind of agreed with this when I, was growing up, is that it's sort of a lack of motivation. And so some of us, that's maybe a little bit more primary. Then there's, of course, depressed ways of thinking, which might be worthlessness. So this idea that I am worthless, there might be that view that that's a part of depression, or maybe that there's suicidal thoughts, that there might be sleep changes, emotional pain. Whenever I think about that, I think about there's a Cymbalta commercial that says depression hurts, Cymbalta can help. So yeah, I think these are, and what I'm gonna share with you is that these beliefs aren't necessarily wrong. In fact, some of them are right. But as you think about depression, kind of understand what is it that um, so if I ask you to just free associate when I said depression, what's the thought that's going to come to mind, or what are the thoughts? Is it sadness? Is it the sleep changes? And if I again, what's your own personal view of depression? Okay, so I want you to kind of think that over right now. Just kind of imagine what are the messages, or maybe it's certain people that you know have depression, or that you suspect have depression. What do they look like? How do they act? Okay, so um, as you do that, I'm going to walk you through the symptoms of major depression according to the DSM-5. So the DSM-5, if you're not familiar with it, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's version 5, and the version 5 came out in about 2013, and it describes major depressive disorder. And most of what I'm going to talk with you today, I will just focus on that. There's a few other depressive disorders, but this is the most common one and the most prominent one. So major depression involves the presence of at least 5 of the following symptoms. All right, so I'm going to walk you through that. The first is depressed mood. So this is they also call it dysthymia. So dysthymia just means sort of a impaired thymia, or emotional life. So sadness would fit with this. The second one is diminished interest or pleasure in activities. Now, I want to just pause. These are the first 2 symptoms, and either depressed mood or diminished interest or pleasure in activities must be present in order to diagnose someone with major depression. So if they don't have that, but they have 5 of the other ones, well, they're still not going to be diagnosed with major depression, because those are the core. And that kind of makes sense, again, with our prototypical understanding of depression as, about mood and motivation. All right, now, when you add to that, what are the other symptoms? Well, the next one is significant weight loss or weight gain. And the parallel is they can also say appetite, increases in appetite or decreases in appetite. All right, so that's a symptom of depression. Next is insomnia or hypersomnia. So if you have difficulty sleeping, difficulty falling asleep, or you sleep beyond typical number of hours, and they don't really define that, but I would imagine if it's 10 or more, you might consider that potentially to be hypersomnia. Over here, you have psychomotor agitation or retardation. And this is going to be really important for our talk here today. So I'll explain that in a minute. Then we have fatigue or loss of energy. So again, just feelings of tiredness, lethargy, not having a lot of energy to go about your day. Then you have feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt. Next is difficulty concentrating. So that's a cognitive aspect. And then another cognitive aspect is the recurrent thoughts of death or suicide. Okay, and so, and of course, this is very critical because major depression is it does pose some risk of suicide. Okay, so but what I want to just kind of draw your attention to here is that this is a very diverse disorder. So if you look through this, of course, there's 9 symptoms, but in a way, if you look at a few of these, you see weight loss or weight gain. In a way, you should maybe think that should be 2 different symptoms, right? So weight loss being one symptom or weight gain being another. Similarly, insomnia or hypersomnia. And then psychomotor agitation, which tends to be increases in activity, restlessness, fidgetiness, or retardation, which is slowing of your psychomotor movement. So these 3 in particular, it's really going either direction, increases or decreases. So even though there's technically 9 symptoms, I like to say there's 12 symptoms, because when you account for these, you you could split them off into 2 different symptoms. Now, what's my point? Well, the fact is that you can have 2 people both diagnosed with major depression who don't actually have any of the same symptoms, because they need to have at least 5 symptoms. And so it could be that one person has depressed mood, and then they have weight loss, insomnia, psychomotor agitation, and fatigue, even if we stop there. And then another person could have diminished interest or pleasure. They could have recurrent thoughts of death or suicide. They can have difficulty concentrating. Maybe they have weight gain and hypersomnia. And so you have a very different case, very different presentation of depression. Okay, so again, when we think about it, sometimes certain aspects of depression are more prominent. But I want to really draw your attention to the psychomotor agitation or retardation. Okay, well, first off, I should point out the DSM-4 did not include psychomotor agitation. It only included psychomotor retardation, which is the slowing of psychomotor movement. Now, in DSM-5, they added in agitation, kind of recognizing that some people, when they're depressed, actually have increased movement. Okay, but I'll come back to that in a little bit. So what is this? Well, this is observable differences in motor movements that are not merely self-report. So you can actually watch a person with depression and be able to identify this symptom, whereas some of the other symptoms of depression, of course, are a little bit more subjective, according to the person's self-report. So their self-report of thoughts of suicide, you cannot actually observe that in terms of identifying their ideation. Similarly, their worthlessness or excessive guilt, you have to just trust that they're going to do this. Well, this one's different in the fact that you could see it. Okay, now agitation. Well, let me give you a few examples of this. Agitation might look like inability to sit still, pacing, hand wringing, which might be like sort of moving the hands around like that, pulling or rubbing of skin, or objects like clothes. Okay, that's what agitation could look like. Retardation is well, again, I use this term. I think there's this, of course, the issue of words change in meaning. But again, when the word retardation was developed, it really meant slowing, and so that's the context of this word in the DSM-5. So they're really talking about psychomotor slowing, and what does that mean? It could include slowed speech, so they might talk a little slower. Their thinking actually tends to be slower as well. So oftentimes they will pause before responding, and there's okay, you ask them a question. Yeah, I could see, so it might take them a couple seconds for them to respond, whereas most people would respond within half a second. And then general body movement. Okay, here's the example. There might be increased pauses before responding, decreased volume, so they speak a little quieter. Decreased inflection, so they don't have as much prosody or rhythm or uh, intonation present in their speech. They might have less amount of speech, so they talk less. In fact, in some cases of depression, they might be mute to some degree, and the decreased variety of speech. So I like to point out that Eeyore is actually a good example of psychomotor retardation, right? You have his speech, oh, bother. I guess this is just going to be another miserable day. You can hear that slowed speech, a little bit of the decreased volume, definitely the decreased inflection, just the flatness of the speech. And, of course, also you have the actual words that he's using, and the depressed content becomes very obvious. But even just with the manner of speaking can be an indication of depression. Okay, so again, DSM-4 only included psychomotor retardation, but this was changed to psychomotor this was expanded to also include psychomotor agitation. Now, I mentioned that because some research, so this is a place where the DSM isn't really, well, there's just some ongoing debate. Some research has suggested that psychomotor agitation may indicate bipolar disorder. So psychomotor retardation definitely goes alongside with major depression, but psychomotor agitation fits with the, some argue, fits more with bipolar disorder, although that's still that's still being debated in the literature. Okay. All right. So what does all that mean? I mentioned before that we tend to think about depression. Most of us probably think about sadness or loss of motivation. And of course, that is an important element. And so I'm not going to argue with that. Major depressive disorder, MDD, it's actually characterized as a mood disorder. But my point is that it's wrong to think of depression as merely a mood disorder. Because there's certainly multiple systems at play, and that includes motor systems. So again, it might be tempting to think, okay, well, it's first and foremost depression, sadness, and the sorry, loss of interest, loss of motivation, and that that maybe you might think, oh, the motor differences are sort of downstream from that because they are sad, because they're um, have lack of interest. That's what slows them down. So again, it, it could be the case that is true, that it's a downstream symptom, but what we find with the biology is that the biological systems involved in depression are also involved in motor movements. And so I would make the argument that we shouldn't think about it as just sort of mood first and foremost. That's the core of it. And just, the motor stuff is sort of a consequence of the mood. No, I think that the mood and motor aspects of it are more interconnected than that. Okay, so if we rethink depression as a mood and motor disorder, that has lots of implications and even suggests a role for you, for physical therapists, not only in assessment and being able to identify motor abnormalities, which I think you guys are probably very well equipped to do, far more equipped than I would even admit myself to be, because I don't tend to watch carefully the motor movements and abnormalities, but also maybe even in treatment. And so I'll mention that towards the end. Okay, so depression and movement. Let's go over a little bit of the biology, because I'm making the argument that it is essentially also a motor disorder. Um, Again, maybe I don't want to argue that mood isn't primary, but that the movement isn't just downstream from that. It's actually more essential to it. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through. Well, first off, we know what parts of the brain are involved in movement. Well, the motor cortex that sort of originates and executes motor activity is in our frontal lobe. So it's a strip just in front of the parietal lobe, and it's involved in making movements of our arms, legs, and different parts of our body, our mouth, and so it's involved in kind of executing movement. The cerebellum, towards the back of our brain, and I'm assuming that you have some basic familiar with the brain, but if not, that's okay. And so the cerebellum back here is involved in coordinating some of those movements. Then you have the basal ganglia, which are involved in timing and inhibition of motor programs. And so they're involved in kind of, in a way, coordinating, but like, okay, if I'm going to move one thing and another, or if I'm going to pick up a coffee mug, I need to sort of time when do I do that particular thing. The basal ganglia seems to be involved in that. Okay. Now, so unsurprisingly, because of the fact that psychomotor retardation is about movement, they've been found to be involved in psychomotor retardation. So the frontal lobe, and the article I present to you identifies this, that especially the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex seems to be involved in the psychomotor retardation. The basal ganglia similarly is involved, and the cerebellum. And I'm not going to get into the details of that because I just want you to know that, again, the psychomotor retardation, the symptom of depression, is involved in these different areas. And so it just sort of identifies like depression affects the same regions of the brain that are involved in movement. That's, I think, very critical for our understanding of depression, to kind of elevate the role of psychomotor movement in depression. Now, just briefly, I want to talk about neurotransmitters, and the three neurotransmitters that have been most strongly linked to depression are serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So they've all been linked to depression. We know that they're connected to it, and that we know that. Well, let me pause there, because each of these are called monoamines. Monoamines. Well, there was a theory of depression that was actually developed in the 60s called the monoamine hypothesis of depression, which basically argued that depression is caused by low levels of serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So the low levels of the monoamines. Now, I wanted to mention that because that hypothesis has been debunked. That is recognized to be untrue. So commonly we hear this sort of explanation of depression that says, oh, it's just, I've got low serotonin today. That's why I'm feeling depressed. Now, I don't want to take away from these neurotransmitters. We know that they're connected, but we also know that it's not so simple as just low levels, that the brain is far more complex than that. So certainly, when you increase the level of serotonin, for example, we can see changes in depression. But if you know anything about SSRIs, you know that they're selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So they're going to increase the level of serotonin at the level of the synapse in between neurons. Now, they work very rapidly to do that. In fact, they'll work on the first day. but you probably also know that antidepressants like SSRIs don't work right away. They take about 4 to 6 weeks to work. So the question would be, why would a medication that works right away take 4 to 6 weeks to show any results? So the thought is, well, the serotonin's involved, but what happens in the brain is the brain gets the immediate boost of the levels of serotonin, but then sort of adapts to it, right? Develops some tolerance to the increased serotonin. And there's some downstream changes as a result of the increased serotonin. And so the thought is that the downstream changes in the brain are what actually relieve depression. Of course, so it's not that immediate taking of serotonin that makes a difference. It's when the brain has adapted to the increased serotonin. So the point being is that it's not, again, so simple as just low levels. They're involved, but the brain's complex. Okay, so I wanted to mention that, but I also want to mention that serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine each have a role in motor functioning. So I'm gonna kind of give you the big overview for each of these. So serotonin, what is it involved in? We know that it's involved in appetite, emotions, motor movements, cognitive processes, sexual functioning, and autonomic functioning. All right, so this kind of makes sense when you think about its link with major depression, because, well, with major depression, you know that there's changes in weight or in changes in appetite. So, okay, that kind of makes sense. We know that, sadness. We know, of course, the psychomotor retardation or agitation. We know the cognitive aspects of depression. So the thoughts of worthlessness or thoughts of suicide, the I'm blanking on another one there. Then, well, sexual. We know that depression, well, it doesn't always have a direct effect on sexuality, but we know that there tends to be some impact on sexual activity. And then, so again, this makes sense that it's involved, but I just want to highlight the motor. So one of the ways that serotonin is involved is it's involved in the constriction of smooth muscles. So again, I'm just trying to point out that we see places where depression and motor activity can converge. The next neurotransmitter, norepinephrine, we know it's involved in memory, attention, stress response, energy, and emotional regulation. Again, that tends to make sense for its role in depression. And in terms of its motor implications, norepinephrine triggers the release of glucose, and it increases blood flow to skeletal muscles. So again, when we think about, okay, is there a relationship there? Yes, it makes sense. Finally, dopamine is involved in reward motivated behavior. Sometimes people call dopamine the pleasure chemical. That's a false understanding of dopamine, and also very common. So I've heard songs talk about dopamine as if it's like, oh, this is what makes you feel good. Well, it's a little different from that. The research contradicts that idea. And so what it seems to do is get you to pursue things, to want things. So it's not about liking things, it's about wanting things. And that's a distinction that kind of matters. And then we have motor control and hormone release. Okay, so again, the point being is that instead of thinking about it as mood first and then later on it has effects on movement, what I'm saying is that we can think about depression as, okay, there's some brain changes, brain implications, and as a result, it's affecting our mood, but also affecting our motor, and maybe, again, thinking about it as sort of parallel dysfunctions. Okay. Now, one of the articles that I shared with you was by Banabi and it talks about psychomotor retardation in depression. And so hopefully you found this helpful to kind of understand the implications. And so, okay, so this was a systematic review of a variety of studies. And one of the things they found is that, and I kind of already mentioned this before, is that psychomotor retardation is associated with speech changes. So speech pause time is longer, and there's a decreased vocal prosody, which is prosody is a word that means sort of the rhythm of our voices, the ups and downs, sort of the intonations. Okay, then in terms of gross motor activity, there is for those who are diagnosed with depression, there's a lower gait velocity. There's reduced cycle length. So they tend to, I think this means that they take shorter steps, but you guys might be better at understanding that than I am. Double limb support, which I believe is having both feet on the ground at the same time. And then lower cycle duration. So again, I think the time for each step. And then there's lower motor activities levels in the late morning, the early afternoon, and early evening. So well, the other article will talk about that a little bit more. In terms of fine motor activity, they've actually found some eye movement abnormalities. There's reduced electromyographic patterns in facial movements for happiness. So they tend to have less muscular movement in response to happy. So if they're asked to demonstrate like happiness, they have less capacity to do that. And then factors influencing psychomotor retardation include being older and male gender. And it seems that those potentially can interact to make psychomotor retardation more severe. All right, so that was one of the articles that you can read for yourself, and that you'll see all the implications, the relationships there. The other article is by Burton et al. And this was a systematic review like the other one, but they did actually do some meta-analyses in the midst of it. So the difference between a systematic review and a meta-analysis is, well, the similarity is that both take a bunch of articles, search for them, and identify them, and sort of select them to review. A systematic review will simply summarize them, and in terms of the findings, sort of help them work together, and it's more of a logical process. Meta-analysis is actually an analysis of the analyses done in each study. And so, okay, so this study was in particular about activity monitoring and depression. So activity monitoring, or actigraphy, is the objective measurement of movements using accelerometers. Now, this was done in 2013, so it's a little dated, but in fact, it's probably more ubiquitous now than it was in 2013, where I've got a smartwatch on right now. This is a Fitbit, and my phone has a accelerometer, and so I've got on me almost all the time a tool that can measure how much activity I'm making, even with moving my hand, and you can see that. And so the question that they were trying to answer is, what's the relationship between our activity levels and depression? Okay, so they found 19 articles, and they summarized them. And let me just point out the limitation is that in each study, participants were unblinded. And so they were told, okay, we're going to study you for a few days or a couple weeks, and we're going to look at your activity levels and see how, if there's any relationship there with your depression. And so they were unblinded, and of course that means that potentially they might have behaved in accordance with what they think the researcher wanted. Okay, so that's a limitation, but I'm not too worried about it, because how much are you actually going to change the way you move across the day or across, especially at night? Um, Probably, maybe not so much. So, okay, daytime activity. What they found that daytime activity was lower for those with depression. And what was interesting is that from pre to post treatment, so before they were treated to versus after they were treated, the daytime activity actually increased. Um, the sleep and nighttime activity, they found that when you compare depressed and non-depressed, they, well, they found there was very heterogeneous findings. So what does that mean? Hetero meaning, different and opposite. And so they basically found studies that were saying different things. Some were saying that depressed had more activity during nighttime, some finding a little bit less. And so they actually made no conclusion on that question. But in terms of pre versus post, they found that after treatment, there was a decrease in activity at nighttime. So this kind of suggests that it sort of suggests that depression might be associated with increased nighttime activity. So, but again, that's not the conclusion they made. Okay, so how do we put all that information together? What kind of conclusions do we make from it? So the presence and degree of psychomotor retardation and agitation could have some implications for medications. Okay, let me take a step back. When I think about treatment, I guess as a psychologist, I generally put treatment into two categories, and I apologize to the physical therapist because I usually don't think about this, to be honest, how it might relate to another field. So I usually place it into medication or therapy, and when we think about medication, it suggests that we need to be careful with certain medications. So some of them, like benzodiazepines, which include Xanax or Valium or Ativan or Klonopin, are the kind of the big four benzodiazepines. They may actually worsen psychomotor retardation. So if you prescribe this to someone who is already depressed and maybe perhaps already has some retardation, they might actually increase that level. Okay, then in terms of ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, this might actually be indicated in certain cases where psychomotor retardation is present, especially when there's also psychotic features. And I'm sorry, I don't have the reference here, but there was evidence from, it might have been one of the articles I sent to you, that suggested that ECT, again, it sounds a little bit, well, it's a form of shock therapy, and which some people are shocked that we still use shock therapy. And but we know that electroconvulsive therapy, when done appropriately, is actually an effective treatment for depression. The main side effect of this treatment is that there can be short-term memory loss. And so the person might have more memory difficulties after receiving this. But when you understand how severe depression can be, where it basically can rob a person of their whole lifestyle, their whole ability to function, you can actually better appreciate that ECT, even though that there's that concern, might actually be a really helpful treatment, especially in cases where medications don't seem to be helpful. And so it's just a kind of just something to be aware of, that it can be helpful. And again, that it's particularly helpful in cases with psychomotor retardation and psychosis. Okay, but all right, I mentioned this. I tend to put only medication and therapy, and I guess my blind spot as a therapist is that actually there's, of course, I recognize the role of exercise. I generally encourage people who are depressed to exercise, but my blind spot has been that if motor activity is so involved, maybe we should be involving physical therapists in the recovery process, because the activity of physical therapy, and the engagement of the not only the body but also the brain areas that are involved in different physical therapy exercises might actually help with recovery from depression, and in particular might help with reducing psychomotor retardation. So I think that's kind of an exciting role that physical therapists could actually play in recovery. And so the again, if we recognize this relationship, there's a lot of options for your role. Now, I want to go back to this idea of assessment and the assessment, because oftentimes I imagine that as physical therapists, you're going to be working in either rehab settings at hospitals, at rehab settings, at well, maybe outpatient settings after an acute rehab stay, and of course, perhaps in more chronic cases where there might be ongoing physical limitations occurring. And so I think one of the things that you should appreciate is that you might be able to help identify depression. Sometimes depression gets missed. People who are depressed don't always talk about their depression. In fact, they can be remarkably hidden about the way that they're feeling. And one of the unique roles that you can play as physical therapists, especially if you're on a multidisciplinary team, is being able to communicate to a psychologist or to the medical provider that a person might need to be screened for depression. And you could actually do that by observing their gait, their speech, what else? Their general motor movement, including fine motor movement, all of which may not on its own be diagnostic in regards to depression, but might be indicative of a screening being appropriate. And again, sometimes people don't acknowledge depression or anxiety or any kind of mental illness because, of course, there's a lot of stigma about them. But if you are able to get that process going, where you could simply acknowledge that, oh, you seem to be slowed, if you could sort of start that process of getting them screened for depression, you might actually really help that person out to be able to acknowledge the symptoms they might be having, and then get them involved in treatment, to get them in therapy or medication that might be helpful to them. And again, also to have this role, perhaps, that your physical therapy might actually be helping in the recovery as well. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. Look forward to sharing with you at your, I'm going to meet with you in a Zoom meeting, and look forward to having some discussion and questions, anything that you might want to know or ask me about, and look forward to doing that. And hopefully you found this helpful. Okay.